Good morning, everyone. Oh, goodness, we can do better. I know it's Monday morning, and I'm sorry I couldn't say personally hi to everyone, but I was trying to work the room a little bit. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We'll get there. We got all day with each other. My name is Shauna Young. I'm the Executive Director here at Duke Tip, and I am so excited to be with you all here today and to introduce our Director of Research and Evaluation, Matt Mako. I have to tell you, I've been anticipating this moment every year. I was up like in the middle of the night trying to make sure my words were just right. So, you know, if I look a little tired, it's because of my excitement to be here with you today. I've met people from all over the country, as far as Hawaii. So I know some of you might have been coming just from up the street or across the country. Today is a special day just for you and your amazing students. And you'll hear me talk about that throughout the day, as well as our team. I won't spend too much time talking about Duke Tip and who we are and what we do, because you're going to hear that throughout the day. I want to introduce Matt and get to his team and presentation so you have a full amount of time with him. Dr. Matt Mako is Duke Tip's Director of Research and Evaluation. He leads a team of researchers and professionals who are focused on helping Tip achieve its mission, aligning Tip with Duke University's commitment to advancing the frontiers of knowledge and creating a new understanding of how best to identify and develop academically talented students. The research division of Duke Tip focuses on its work on three primary areas: original research, operational support, and public communication. Personally, Matt's research focuses on how academically talented students are identified, served, and how they experience the world. Additionally, his methodological, I was going to say that wrong, I knew it was. I almost got it. Work explores research methods and emphasizes open science and collaborative research practices. Matt received his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Duke University, Master's of Arts in Developmental Psychology from Cornell University, and PhD in Educational Psychology from Indiana University. Please welcome Matt Mako. I just hit something, I'm sorry.
Okay, so now my first test that Shauna has given me is to figure out how to make the PowerPoint show up again. Mission accomplished. The hard part's over. Thank you so much, Shauna. I'm thrilled to be here. We're all thrilled to be here. Like many of you, this is our first time at this event. So we're excited to share our work with you. And what we're going to be talking about today is a quick overview of what does the research say about all of you in the audience today. How we're going to share that is we're going to try to do a series of what are called lightning talks. So they'll be relatively quick. It's going to be about 6 to 8 minutes long for each of them, so this is not going to be a lecture class. We're not going to go in depth into a bunch of statistics and methodological, I think I got it, aspects of research. What we're really going to try to focus on is research findings that are going to be relevant to all of you, and also, we hope, interesting and actionable, so that's something that you can use when you go home after today. Some of the work that we'll be talking about is work that our team has done, but not necessarily all of it. It may be just work that others have done from outside the field or our colleagues have done. You may be familiar with TED Talks. This isn't quite that, but we hope to be that interesting and engaging. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to start with a quick overview of some things that we're going to talk about. I'll start by reviewing what the research says about adulthood outcomes of academically talented individuals. I'll talk a little bit about some professional outcomes, as well as what research says about some personal outcomes as well. And then we're going to backtrack, and I'll turn it over to some of my team, and they'll talk about how to get there. First, Dr. Rick Courtwright, who's here on my immediate left, who is a gifted education research specialist here at TIP, and I don't have quite the formal introduction that Shauna gave me for my team. Rick and I share the fact that we started at TIP on the same day, and you may, if you've been to other TIP events, or other ceremonies. You may recognize Rick from them because he does a lot of work for us there. After Rick, and he's going to talk about high school options of what you can do in high school to prepare for the adulthood outcomes that I'll be talking about. And then Dr. Jarrett Hodges, who's a postdoctorate research associate with us here at TIP for a few more months. And then he'll be leaving us to move back to Texas, where he'll be starting a faculty position at the University of North Texas in Denton. He'll be talking about the importance of opportunities and role models and what the research says about that. And then to wrap up our final presentation, Victoria Johnson, who gets to sit in the middle there today. She's actually a Duke undergrad. She's a rising senior now because the school year is over for Duke, so she's a college senior. She's worked with us for the last 3 years as an undergraduate research assistant, and she'll be talking about what the research has to say about effective advocacy for academically talented individuals. And also joining us on stage, which we're thrilled to have her. We weren't sure if she was going to be available today or if she would have a more pressing responsibility, is Dr. Jill Adelson there. She's a research scientist with us here at TIP, and we've already warned her that although there are many doctors on stage, we are all PhDs, and so if she happens to have an urgent need for a doctor come up, we will not be able to help her whatsoever, although maybe somebody in the audience will have some more relevant doctor skills than what we've got. But we're thrilled to have Jill join us, and so she's not presenting because we didn't know if she'd be able to be here today. However, we're going to wrap up with a Q&A, and if any of you ask any particularly difficult questions, we'll make sure Jill gets to answer those. So to start off, I want to share with you one of my all-time favorite photographs. And I know you may think it's a little funny or weird that I'm showing you this photograph to start off when we're talking about adulthood outcomes of academically talented individuals, but we'll get there. So this is one of my favorite photographs of all time. This is a photograph of Robert Wadlow, who was born in Illinois in 1918, and as you may have a sneaking suspicion, he is the tallest human on record. Just after his 22nd birthday, he was measured at 8 feet 11.1 inches tall. 8 foot 11. That's almost 9 feet. That's pretty amazing to me. But even more than this photo, I love the caption, which I've blown up for you here, just to be able to see. This is what the caption says. I love this. I have no idea who wrote this, but I love them for it. Because in case, him being the tallest human on record isn't clear enough, I mean, can you even see which one of them is wearing glasses in the photograph? It's not clear at all. What is clear is that one of them is a giant. And so just here's another photograph that I love of Robert. This is Robert with all of his high school classmates. And in case you can't make out his glasses, I added the red arrow so that you can be sure to tell which one is Robert. But of course you don't need the arrow. I'm glad I heard some laughs. That makes me feel good. I get a little worried if we're not in the same sense of humor lineup. But of course you don't need that arrow. It's clear. He's physically, literally, head, shoulders, and most of his torso taller than his classmates. He's a physical giant. And a point that I often have to make when I'm giving talks to a very different audience than this one is that not only are there physical giants, but there are academic giants too. And they exist. They stand out just as much as physical giants, only we may not be able to tell who the academic giants are just via a photograph. We may need a different way of measuring and being able to see who those academic giants are. And to start off, rather than just talking about physical giants, I want to tell you a quick story about some of the academic giants that TIP has identified and recognized previously. So first, I want to talk about Franklin Leonard, who is a film executive in Hollywood, and he's the founder of The Blacklist. Now, that's not the TV show. This talk was easier before there was a TV show called The Blacklist. What The Blacklist that he founded was, it's an annual list of the most liked screenplays in Hollywood that have not yet been produced. So in his world, that's a really important list, because he He and his colleagues want to find what are the best screenplays and most liked screenplays that haven't been made yet, because it's their job to find them and make them. Some movies that have been on the blacklist before that you may be familiar with because they've gone on to make a lot of money and won some awards are movies like Argo, Slumdog Millionaire, Spotlight. There's just a really, really long list of movies, and he helps coordinate, in addition to his regular job of making films, he helps coordinate kind of the list of what are the hot unmade screenplays. Sticking in the world of film is Morgan Dameron, who was actually honored at this event last year as a TIP Early Achiever. She has written, directed, and produced her own film, Different Flowers, and I'm sure she'll go on and spend her career making many, many more films, but her current claim to fame, and I think what will probably remain her claim to fame for the rest of her life, because this is a pretty hard feat to beat, you may recognize her last name. It may stick out to some of you as being familiar, and that's because she's also done some work with the filmmaker J.J. Abrams, who wrote and directed the Star Wars movie The Force Awakens. And when he was writing that film, he named the character of the pilot Poe Dameron after Morgan. So Poe Dameron has his name because of Morgan Dameron. I don't know. She could make a lot of really cool movies and be very, very successful. I don't know that any of that will be able to beat having a Star Wars character named after you, at least in my book. That's a dream that I didn't even know that I should be aspiring to achieve. I think that's pretty cool. But then moving outside of the kind of the film world is Dr. Ananth Natarajan, who does not have a very famous name. To my knowledge, he does not have a Star Wars character named after him. But he's done some pretty cool stuff. He co-founded a company that actually creates upper limb prosthetics that are used by thousands of people across the world. He's helped create that and develop that technology. And another interesting fact that I just learned about him was that he actually graduated from Duke with a double major at the age of 18, which I think is pretty impressive. Another TIP former distinguished alum is Dr. Diane Tang, who's currently a Google Fellow and has in the past led Google's search team to develop its ads quality. And I'm pretty sure everybody here has heard of Google, right? They're a pretty large company. They bring in a lot of revenue every year. I think the bulk of that revenue comes from their ad quality of placing advertisements in there. And she led their team for many, many years on how to maximize that ad quality. So she had one of their top tech positions at Google for a long time and still does, but now she's shifted, I believe, to work more in Google's healthcare workforce area. And I've got one final example that I love to give, just because this is one of the coolest job titles that I think I've ever seen before, which is a TIP distinguished alum, Richard Hatchett. This is his job title, not his job description, his job title. Chief Medical Officer and Deputy Director for Strategic Sciences, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I haven't seen it, but I feel like his business card has to be like a full 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, because I don't know how else he gets it on a regular size business card. But yeah, I mean, if any of you think that name is familiar, it's probably because you watched the first season of Survivor, and the guy who won it, I think, has the same name. This is not him. He was not on the TV show Survivor ever. But we don't know his name at all. But when you look at what he does, what this job responsibility was in charge of the U.S. federal government's strategic planning if we had a flu pandemic. That's a hugely, hugely important responsibility. He's not a household name at all, but whomever has that job, it is very important to me personally that they be very qualified for that job. And I want them to have all that training, because that's just a huge, huge responsibility. And so I think, perhaps with the exception of Morgan Dameron, now that you know that the Star Wars character is named after her, all of these individuals have had a large amount of success but do not have household names that are necessarily particularly familiar. But what they do have in common was that their talent was identified by a talent search when they were in 7th grade. And I often get, when I like to use these examples, because I think they kind of are a good take-home message and are more memorable than using maybe some big numbers, but I still often get a common question is, well, how do we identify? How do we find these types of individuals, and can we? And so one of the questions that we've asked in a research paper is, so do these early indicators of extraordinary intellectual promise, do they actually identify those who go on in adulthood to make truly outstanding contributions? Or is just doing well on some standardized test on one Saturday morning when you're in 7th grade, does that just tell you that you're a good test taker, and then that's it? Or is it actually related to some predictive value of adulthood accomplishments? Now, if I was a mystery writer novelist, A, I probably wouldn't be standing here right now, but B, I might save the answer to this question for the end for some special plot twist. But I'm not that. I am here. I'm a researcher. So I'm going to tell you generally what we found in our research is the answer to this question is yes. There is a strong relationship between early extraordinary accomplishment and outstanding adulthood contributions. So in some of I'm going to talk today a little bit about one particular research project and what we found with that, but I want to start off by kind of explaining what we're talking about with outstanding, an early indicator of outstanding accomplishment. And so for some research, you may look at, say, maybe the top 1 in 100. Or if you wanted to get really, really select, maybe it was even the top 1 in 1,000. That's 1,000 dots along the bottom here. For our research project, we didn't look at that. We looked at the top 1 in 10,000. There are 10,000 dots there. And it takes a particular set of skills to be able to find that top 1 in 10,000. You need a particular way of looking at things to find that top 1 in 10,000. And the tool that we used to be able to find that top 1 in 10,000 was the SAT or ACT as an above-level test. And just to kind of show you how difficult it is, I see somebody pointing at the screen, so I don't know if they spotted it, but there actually is one of these dots that is different than the other 9,999. And so I see some people pointing at the screen. And so what we do to find that is we use the SAT and ACT. So I'll actually show you inside that A, the dot in there is purple, whereas all the rest of them are black. I'll kind of go back to let you see. Once you see it, you're like, oh, yeah, there it is. And don't feel bad if you can't see it. There's many, many people who it's too blurry and fuzzy. We use the SAT and ACT. And so what we did was, just like you went through, and found the top 1 in 10,000 individuals at the 7th grade level, and then waited until they were at adulthood. We were really patient here. And said, well, what were their educational, occupational, and creative accomplishments? And they were about 40 years old or so at the time. And so I'm going to walk you through some of what we found for their educational, occupational, and creative accomplishments. Just to give you a reference point, the score at that top 1 in 10,000, that's roughly about a 700 on the SAT math or a 630 on the verbal section. So not quite what it is here today, but it's pretty close. So in terms of educational accomplishments, in the United States, less than 2% of adults have a doctorate of some sort. So that would be PhD, a law degree, or an MD. But then what we've found is the top 1% of scorers, it's actually about 23% go on to earn a doctorate of some sort. And then that top 1 in 10,000, 37% had gone on to earn a doctorate of some form by the age of 40. Similarly, in the US, about 1% of adults hold a patent of some form, but in our particularly select sample, it was about 8.5% of them had at least one patent, and a couple individuals had a couple dozen patents. It's kind of hard. Next up, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the types of jobs and careers they've gone into, but that's hard to kind of summarize. So instead, what I've done is I have a quick list of different types of jobs that they had, and that I'll kind of go through here. So for example, in the corporate sector, here's a couple jobs that they had when we were doing this study. And again, this is, I think, a clear indication of the magnitude of their responsibility, similar to what we'd had when I was showing you some of the specific examples. In the medical field, here's some sample professions they had. Again, this is at the age of 40 so it's not necessarily their peak of their career. They're still going to have a long time to develop professional responsibilities. And it's really easy for me to just kind of run through all this and ignore it. But the chief of hematology at a U.S. medical school, again, that's a really important job where we want the person to have great training and be really, really good at their job. Here's some examples from the law and information technology field. To us, the big takeaway here is, again, that early indicators are identifying individuals who go on to hold important leadership positions in really large organizations. Again, I talked about how in the U.S. adulthood, about just under 2% of adults have a doctorate of some form. I'm a researcher, so getting tenure, being a faculty member at a research institution, that feels like a really big deal to me. About 7% of the select sample had earned tenure. And so again, if less than 2% of adults have a doctorate of some sort, but more than 3 times that have earned tenure already by age 40, that's a pretty impressive accomplishment as a baseline. So again, early indicators, we think, predict and identify those who can make truly outstanding contributions? We think yes. However, there's some reminders and caveats that I want to give because I don't want to set too high expectations for all the kids here, and I don't want anyone to walk out of here and think, oh, well, I'm going to be the chief of hematology in a couple years. I'm going to go play video games for a while now because that's just automatically going to happen, right? That's what we went to Duke, and that's what they told us. No, not quite. These are just some highlights that I wanted to give to you to give an example of the magnitude and pattern of adulthood accomplishments that former tipsters have gone on to do. This is not everyone. It's not automatic. There's a lot of time and effort and opportunity that my colleagues are going to be talking about in a couple minutes that these individuals took advantage of and had available to them. And the other reminder that I always like to give is that there's more to life than work. And so I want to segue quickly. You're over halfway done with me, then I'll turn it over to everybody else, is to talk about how do academically talented individuals live and how do they want to live. There's been some research on, again, a very similar group to the adult version of tipsters when they've hit their mid-30s to early 40s. A group of people asked them, what's important to you in life? How much do you want to work? What type of work do you want to do? What are your life values? What's important to you in life? But before I get to that, I want to give another quick example. Here's a picture of Allison and Jeff, who started dating when they were undergraduates here at Duke. And they'd been dating for a while and were going to visit a friend of Allison's that she'd had from when she was at TIP. And only then did Allison and Jeff realize that they did not meet as college undergraduates. They actually met at TIP when Allison and her roommate were at a TIP program and decided they wanted to meet every single boy in their dorm at the program. So they went and knocked on the door of every boy and introduced themselves. And it's kind of hard to tell here, but Allison is just over 6 feet tall. And so she's a memorable person when you meet her. And then it was only at that point, after they'd been dating for a while, that Jeff realized, oh yes, I've actually known you since I was about 14 years old. Then a few years after they graduated from Duke, they got married, and the officiant for their wedding ceremony was actually a person who had been their instructor for a TIP program in different years, but he was the officiant at their wedding when they got married. And I love telling marriage stories about Duke TIP, even though I don't count because I was not a tipster, but as a full-time employee of TIP, that is also how I met my wife. So TIP has done great things for marriages and weddings. And I'm not saying that she's not here. She's actually in New York right now, but I'm thrilled to have met my wife, and it's because I happen to be an employee of Duke TIP. But you're not here to hear more about me. You actually are probably more interested in what kind of the researchers had found with their results. And in general, I'm going to give you their overall conclusion from the surveys was that they found that they appeared content. When asked about their professional and personal lives and how they want to be living their lives and are they satisfied or very satisfied with their lives, in general, they were very, very content with their work preferences and their life values. Now, you're at a Duke TIP event, and all of you are here because of performance on a standardized assessment. So we're going to give you a little quiz, because it wouldn't be TIP without some sort of assessment. So what I'm going to do on the next slide is I'm going to show you some of their findings about what was important to two groups of these academically talented individuals who are now in their mid to late 30s. And I want to see if you can tell me how the two sets of responses had been divided. And so I'll kind of go through everything, and then I'll ask to see if anybody has figured it out. So in the left-hand column, we've got this group says having the option to have a part-time career was relatively important to them, whereas on the right-hand side, the group said, nope, having a full-time career is very important to me. On the left, having strong friendships, really important. On the right, having a lot of money, that's important. On the left, giving back to the community. On the right, being recognized for being the best in their professional community was important. Then the last one on the left is living close to family was important. And then on the right, this group thought society should invest in them because of their skills. Who's got a guess about how this group? I think I see one. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, so the left is Duke Tip and the right was not Duke Tip. Okay. Any other guesses? It's half and half. So you're right. It is about half and half. You can feel free to shout it out. There's no way, I can't really see hands. The left side is girls and the right side is boys. Well done. Now, of course, this is not totally separate where every woman said the answer on the left and every man said the answer on the right. But that's where the similarities started to break down, was that there were career and life preference goal differences between men and women in the academically talented individual group. Now, if you talk to your parents or to talk to other adults, you may find this isn't necessarily unique to the academically talented individual group. This follows a general trend that many researchers have found about differences between men and women, particularly in the US. And so there were many similarities, but this is one difference that they found. And the difference actually expands a little bit also for individuals of whether or not they had children. And what they found was that actually that parents were more satisfied with their lives than those without children. And the most satisfied subgroup were mothers. With both their work and their personal lives. But in general, again, most were satisfied or very satisfied with their careers, but there were some differences between whether or not the individual was a man or a woman, or whether or not they had a child, differences in what was particularly important to them. So that's all I have for you. Next, we're going to turn things over to Dr. Rick Courtwright, and he's going to talk a little bit about how do you get to all of these adulthood accomplishments and outcomes, and he's going to talk about some high school options.
Thank you, Matt. I'm very honored to be here this morning among these esteemed colleagues. And I'm reminded of a comment made by comedian George Gobel when he was on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, kids ask your parents, several years ago. When looking at the guests on the show that night, he turned to Johnny, he said, "I feel like the world is a tuxedo and I'm a pair of brown shoes." I'm not a scientist. I'm an educator, a lifelong educator, having started as a 7th grade teacher and then was a gifted resource teacher and then for 20 years a gifted program administrator. And I have answered and talked with parents about their questions about career paths, academic paths, and I want to share with you some things this morning that I have shared with them in the past, as well as some of the research that backs that information up. So what I'd like to talk with you about is charting the course. What are some of the options for you and your path through high school? What the research says, bottom line is what works for gifted and talented learners is acceleration. Acceleration works. Acceleration means moving through the traditional curriculum at rates faster than typical. The various forms of acceleration include grade skipping, early entrance to school, and advanced placement courses. It's appropriate educational planning. It means matching the level of complexity of the curriculum with the readiness and the motivation of the student. Research studies show that acceleration is the best, most cost-effective academic intervention for high-ability, highly motivated students. The research is incontrovertible. A source of information I would recommend to you that I drew heavily from for my remarks this morning, 2 documents available to you on the internet. One is for free, the other at a modest cost. Developed at the University of Iowa's Bell and Blank Center. A Nation Deceived was published almost 20 years ago. More recently, an update, A Nation Empowered, was published, and both of these were developed to be advocacy documents for families interested in persuading the policymakers to allow opportunities for students who are gifted and talented to be accelerated in their academic experience. And a number of different research findings are included in these 2 documents. Each has 2 volumes. The first is a narrative, basically to make the case, and the second volume that's separate is a set of very scholarly, academic, well-researched documents that provide the research to back up the arguments. And I highly commend these to you. Some of the findings that are in there, beginning with Dr. Karen Rogers, who studied more than 50,000 students involved in academic accelerated learning. Her conclusion from her article in Chapter 2 of A Nation Empowered said, gifted students in accelerated programs make notable academic gains. Given a chance, they flourish, regardless of the type of acceleration provided. And the other inescapable finding, students in almost all acceleration programs also advanced socially and emotionally, especially those who are mentored, that it isn't a risky proposition to accelerate in terms of one's social or emotional development. So with all of the positive research out there regarding the outcomes, then why do our nation's schools work so hard to hold back America's brightest students, in the words of A Nation Deceived? And you can see there are several reasons that they share up there. And one of the highlights is they fear that acceleration might hurt children socially, and they worry about, the driver's license or the senior prom, totally disregarding the elements of academic growth and development that kids are ready for. And where this comes from is a psychological construct that I like to share with parents. It's something you probably have a sense of but didn't know there was a name for it. And the name for it is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a phenomenon that takes place that despite the fact that we talk heavily about research-based practices in education, when a parent goes to a principal and says, we think our child is advanced enough to skip the next grade, can we move ahead? And the principal leans back in his chair and he tucks his thumbs down in his belt and he says, well, you know, my next door neighbor has a hairdresser who's got a cousin whose nephew skipped a grade and it didn't work out well. We're not going to do that. Paying more attention to his own background and experience, confirming that bias against the notion of it, and despite the fact of what research says. Good news is, as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, the good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. And the truth is that acceleration works for gifted students. Why do we have such problems and issues with moving kids into that opportunity? Well, one of the co-authors of those documents, A Nation Deceived and a Nation Empowered, Dr. Susan Asseline from the University of Iowa's Bell and Blank Center says, the disasters are memorable. It only takes one instance of an accelerated student who doesn't adjust well to convince busy administrators and harried educators that the safe choice, doing nothing, is better than being sorry. But doing nothing is also a decision. Her colleague and co-author, Dr. Nick Colangelo, in studying the outcomes of students who were accelerated, wrote, the part that stuck with me is that these students later in life, when they're adults, are saying if they could do it over again, they'd want more chances at acceleration. That when it comes to acceleration as an intervention, we do have consistently robust research evidence. However, that hasn't been enough to put acceleration into common practice. Students who are moved ahead, the research shows, tend to be more ambitious. They can earn graduate degrees at higher rates than other students, and interviewed years later, the overwhelming majority of accelerated students say that acceleration was an excellent experience for them. How do we accelerate students? Well, in A Nation Empowered, we had 20 possible ways of being accelerated in terms of one's academic experience. Now, most of those are opportunities that are behind you now as seventh graders, but what lies ahead includes a couple of very powerful opportunities for you to consider and take advantage of and to think about as you proceed through middle school and on into high school and beyond. The first of those is advanced placement courses, which we know are challenging college-level courses offered to high-ability students when they're in high school. Typically juniors and seniors, although there are some exceptions for some courses to be able to be taken at sophomore year. And students are tested on the material at the year's end. And if they score highly, they actually may get college credit earned for that performance. And even if they don't score that highly, they're still better prepared for college-level work. Researchers are now looking at ways for more students to better access advanced placement courses while simultaneously ensuring student success in those courses based on readiness, personality, interest, ability, and motivation. In 2014, more than 4.2 million AP exams were taken by more than 2.3 million students, a number that was doubled over the previous 10 years as more and more students are taking advantage of this opportunity. Advanced placement courses constitute the most frequently used strategy to permit advanced levels of work for high school students who are gifted. Part of this has to do with the comfort level that educators and parents have with this option, which often results in savings at the university level in tuition costs for credits given. Another opportunity that is not as readily available, but one that I would submit is every bit as good an opportunity, is that of International Baccalaureate. International Baccalaureate is a program that was established to provide a consistent format for academic curriculum, scope and sequence on an international level so that as students went through schools, primarily overseas schools, they laid out a rigorous approach to teaching and learning in a curriculum that was designed to be standardized across the world. It was rigorous and challenging to such a degree that although it wasn't designed for gifted students specifically, it certainly meets the needs of those students. In 2019, there were 6,608 programs being offered worldwide. 945 schools in the United States offer the diploma program. Dr. Joyce Van Tassel-Basca wrote, the International Baccalaureate Diploma Program provides students the equivalent of undergraduate work at a selective liberal arts college. It's also widely accepted at universities abroad and allows a student to receive advanced credit and placement for their high school work in the program. The key to IB is that a school can't just hang out a shingle and say, we are an IB school. There is a licensing and certification process that takes 3 years. The faculty has to be trained, and it is an extensive, intensive process. If you have an established IB program in your district available to you, it's definitely an acceleration opportunity worth considering. Another strategy for working with accelerated youth is that of early entrance to college. A number of research studies show a vast majority of gifted students entering college early succeed academically and present a fairly compelling picture of high achievement and success. As a group, these entrants are not hampered by social or emotional issues. High performance in their classes is the norm, and later in life, researchers also find that early entrants are achieving at high levels, are highly productive, earn above average incomes, while having satisfying social relationships. This form of acceleration has a long history, from the University of Chicago first allowing early entry in 1937, and in the 1950s, the Ford Foundation helped expand this to numerous other universities. Johns Hopkins University, which established the first talent search, the granddaddy of them all, the parent of TIPS program, began the program in 1977 when a youngster was admitted at the age of 15. The picture up on the screen is of a youngster I knew and had the pleasure of working with many years ago. Lenny was a student in the 5th grade who happened to have the opportunity to sign on to the talent search and took the college entrance exam. And Lenny, as a 5th grader, scored a perfect 800 on the math portion of the test. In fact, for a time, he was the youngest student to ever get such a score. It has since been eclipsed. But Lenny stayed with his age mates through 12th grade, but throughout his high school career, commuted across town to his neighborhood university just down the road, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he took advantage of college-level math courses while he was in high school, having exhausted all of the courses in the high school, and performed exceedingly well. He went on to go to Harvard and MIT and is currently a professor here at Duke University. He was a delightful person and had friends not only through his academics, but through his music and his soccer playing, and made the adjustment quite well. That kind of early admission to college is predicated on a couple of things: the convenient location of a college or university nearby, and the willingness of the college or university to accept a student at a young age. But the outcomes research shows the outcomes tend to be very positive for those students. Another opportunity to be considered is that of dual enrollment. 29 states now offer dual enrollment opportunities, allowing students to take college classes and earn college credits while still in high school. Again, you stay with your age mates, but you take college-level classes, sometimes on the high school campus, but sometimes on a nearby college campus. This is a picture of a young man, a tipster. His name is Braxton Morale. He's being recognized by the Kansas Department of Education for his outstanding scholarship. This past weekend, yesterday, Braxton is enjoying a dual diploma weekend. He is graduating both from Ulysses High School in Kansas, in his hometown, and Harvard University. He's getting a diploma in both. I've been in touch with his father since Braxton was a 7th grader, and we've talked extensively about opportunities for him, and Braxton signed up for a program at Harvard called the Harvard Extension School, one of 12 degree granting programs at Harvard, designed for off-campus students seeking part-time online programs. His math teacher helped him as a proctor working through the coursework at Harvard, but pursuing his Harvard degree didn't keep Braxton from having a typical high school experience. He participated in debate, forensics, the Scholars Bowl, prom, tennis team, the whole works. But they constantly keep an eye on him to make sure that everything is going well, and it really has been a very extraordinarily successful experience for him. His motivation, his intellectual ability, his academic ability outstanding. Another possibility for you to consider is what we refer to as specialized residential high schools. Julia Link Roberts and Corey Alderdice in A Nation Empowered wrote about the current situation with these specialized schools in A Model for Accelerated Learning. State STEM schools provide opportunities for advanced students with talent, interest, and motivation to thrive as learning ceilings are removed. These residential schools offer appropriate opportunities for students to accelerate in their academics and to enjoy a living, learning community that encourages students to learn at advanced levels that are atypical for their age mates. They participate in mentoring, in research, in service learning, and in global experiences that are more usual for college students than for high school students. They learn at these high levels with others who are also talented and interested in STEM studies. The table in the image that you see is in that chapter in A Nation Empowered, and it lists the schools. There are 15 states that all currently offer this. The image there is of Hill Hall, the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics, the nation's first, I'm proud to say, the first residential high school for juniors and seniors, and an extraordinary opportunity. The other states listed around it also have a similar program, such as TAMS in Texas, the program at Western Kentucky University, the Gatton Academy. These are opportunities that if they are within your purview, if you're a resident of the state, which is typically a requirement, something definitely to look into. The tough part for a parent is letting a youngster go off to school, away to school 2 years early, but the payoff is very much worth it. Last area that I would like to offer for your consideration is called radical acceleration. Radical acceleration allows highly gifted students with very advanced academic ability to graduate from high school 2, 3, or more years early. Researchers such as Linda Brody and Michelle Moratori in their Early Entrance to College chapter in A Nation Empowered found that such profoundly gifted students generally succeed academically and socially in college despite being much younger than their classmates. In fact, the majority do better academically and socially. They continue to be at the top of their field. The image you see up there is of Michael, a youngster I met when he was 3 years old and started school in the district where I was district coordinator of gifted education, started at the age of 5 in a third grade program for highly gifted students, which was a pretty good fit except for math. He had to have a tutor for mathematics because he was finishing pre-algebra and moving into Algebra 1. He spent 4 years at the elementary school in our highly gifted program. He skipped middle school completely and went to high school, where he exhausted all of the AP science, math, and computer technology courses by the time he was 12 years old. He did not get a diploma because as a 10, 11, 12-year-old, the themes in literature and in world studies and man's inhumanity to man were such that as a sensitive youngster, it was determined that what was in his best interest was to focus on the sciences. But even without a high school diploma, where it says freshman age 13, that doesn't mean high school freshman, that means a freshman at Wake Forest University, which accepted him as a student majoring in mathematics and computer science. He lived at home, but he had a place in a dorm that was a professed, students solemnly swore to be drug-free, and he became an integral part of the campus there. Radical acceleration for some students is a great opportunity to move quickly past what they already know and know how to do and move them into opportunities where they can get a year's worth of growth for a year in school. Finally, as we look at these different options, John Way was our colleague immediately prior to Jarrett. John Way was our postdoc intern at Duke Tip, has published regularly in Psychology Today and another terrific gentleman. And his contribution to that volume on A Nation Empowered talked about the dose. How much of this do you need? And is there one best way? And his conclusion from his research was there isn't one that's significantly better than any other. There isn't a particular magic bullet, but what was significant in terms of outcomes was having access to many or to multiples of these kinds of accelerative experiences. So, as a parent, and as I've talked with parents over the years, what is the perfect solution? Well, it's highly likely the perfect solution doesn't exist for a youngster like yours. What then it requires of you is to explore the options that are available to you and your child, and then to choose the least imperfect solution that is available. And I'd like to, if I may, offer in closing the words of my mentor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Yes, I am a Tar Heel. When Dr. James Gallagher wrote, "Failure to help the disabled child reach his potential is a personal failure for him and his family. But failure to help the gifted child reach his potential is a societal tragedy, the extent of which is difficult to measure, but which is surely great. For how can we measure the sonata unwritten, the curative drug undiscovered, the absence of political insight? They are the difference between what we are and what we could be as a society." Thank you. And I want to bring forward Jarrett for his remarks.
So I'm going to talk about a paper. It describes who innovates, the role of exposure to innovation. So innovation is the really big term nowadays. You hear it with Google, with Apple, with Tesla. It's on everybody's lip. Who innovates? We need more of them. We need more inventors. We need more innovators. Media always has this romantic view of innovation. They always have this one gentleman or young woman who sits there with a problem, concentrating very deeply, and they have this aha moment, and then all the innovation comes from that. They don't really ever show the training, the education, the interest, and everything that goes beyond it. Also, by the way, just a little heads up, there will be ever so slight and gentle in-game spoilers with this presentation. I hope that doesn't bother anybody. It's been about a month now, so I hope that if you haven't seen it, you're not going to see it, and if you have seen it, then maybe you'll get some of the references. So here's one of the big innovators of the Marvel Universe, which is Tony Stark. He uses his innovation to make weapons of destruction, you know, robotic suits, and fights aliens and does everything else like that. So as far as when we talk about what makes Tony Stark an innovator, researchers have a little bit of an idea about it. Opportunity is the first one. In Tony Stark's case, his father was a billionaire. That gave him lots and lots and lots of opportunity. But money isn't opportunity, isn't the only way to provide opportunity. One of the ways that everyone in the audience shares is letting their child participate in TIP. That's an access to an opportunity. The other one that we know, too, is that IQ is correlated with innovation. Just as Matt said, those who are usually with higher academic ability hold more patents. They're more likely to have doctorate degrees. We know these things. But we have another idea that we've finally been able to measure. Before, scholars have known or had a hunch that the environment, everybody knows that the environment matters. We know it. We just didn't really know how to measure it. So there's one thing to know in science, like to know, to feel, and then there's a definite other thing to know and to be able to provide evidence. So what they found is exposure. It's who becomes an innovator in America, the importance of an exposure. This is the title of a paper that came out of Harvard recently by an economist named Raj Chetty. If you haven't heard of him yet, that's okay. He's one of the top, probably, innovators in the field of economics. What he was able to do, him and his lab, was take tax returns, something very boring, and put it with patents, also something very boring, and put those together. And what he was able to infer was to see how things relate, particularly geographic features. He was able to match who holds a patent from how much money they have, where they're from, and what geographically is around them. And there's some really interesting things that you can kind of infer from this kind of research and that we can take away from it. So what are the big takeaways? Now, the first two will seem a little similar, but the first one is people tend to more likely be innovators when around other innovators. That kind of makes sense. The second one is people tend to more likely be innovators in areas they are exposed to as children. I'll talk a little bit more about that one. And the last one is girls tend more likely to be innovators when exposed to other female innovators. And in terms of boys, it didn't matter for boys if they were exposed to female or male innovators. They just needed to be around innovators. So the first two seem kind of close, kind of similar, but there are some subtle differences between the two that make a large difference. So for the second one, where you grow up as a child has a large influence on what you end up innovating in. If you grow up, say, in Houston, around the medical center, there's a good chance that they found that you'll grow up to innovate in the field of biomedicine or in medicine in general. If you grow up, I'm going to use a lot of Texas references. Just to forewarn you, I am from Texas, so I have a good idea about things in Texas. So if I don't give your state or know where it's going on in Tampa or other ones, it's all right. You know. So if you grow up in Dallas-Fort Worth, around the financial sector there, and you end up being exposed to a lot of that, there's a good chance that you'll innovate in maybe financial instruments. If you grow up in Austin, around all this music and art scene, maybe you'll go into that field. One of these things that they found is what you're exposed to also has a development on what you are interested in. To use some of my background, I grew up in rural Texas, and in my tiny little rural Texas town, the primary employer is the school district. My mother was a principal. My sister is a counselor. My family, half of them are employed at the school district. So if Raj Chetty were to see me up here talking about education as a researcher in education, he would probably say, oh, that makes a little sense. You were exposed around that. You saw the problems of it. Of course you have some interest in that. So we know that what you're exposed to as a child has some influence. One little caveat of there has to be interest from the child. So from the parents in the audience who are thinking, I just got to get my kid into the hospital and make them stay there, and they will grow up to be a doctor. That might not work. It takes a little bit of interest in the first place. But in my own case, growing up around the schools, I saw some of the problems in the schools. I saw some of what it did well and what it could do improve on. I became interested in it. So that's one of the things with children. The other one is the first one. What's the difference between that and the first one? It's to innovate, you have to be around other innovators. You have to be exposed to them. A culture of innovation makes a big difference. And the last one thing I want to point out here too, in all of these, I am purposefully using the word more likely. More likely. There isn't a quick fix. In a lot of these cases, what you're doing is you're putting your thumb on the scale. So in the case of girls tend to be more likely for, again, the parents in the audience who have maybe a young lady who's interested in science, or on the other hand, if they're not interested in science, say you want to have them interested in computer science, taking them down to Google when they have no interest in it is not going to suddenly make them say, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm interested in. You have to have those interests already inherent. So what can you do? Well, find those who innovate. That really helps. This doesn't mean move to the Bay Area again. Pack up and buy $1 million home with 1,000 square foot in the Bay Area. This probably is not a good idea. There are other things that you can do. You can, like you're doing here, be involved in TIP. You can take advantage of online resources. You can take advantage of what's locally around you. If you're next to a big city, take a chance to go on campus. Take a chance to talk to some of the faculty there. Take a chance to talk to some of the graduate students there or the postdocs there. Get your child involved in that way. Get them to see what's out there, what's available. To use an example, when I was in rural Texas, there was only math. The only kind of math I believe there was calculus, because that was the #1 math in high school. I had no idea that there was a large, greater field of mathematics outside of just calculus. The reason was I wasn't exposed to it. So it's hard to have an interest and want to be an innovator in a field that you haven't necessarily been exposed to in the first place. The second one is opportunity. Like I keep saying over and over, opportunity needs interest. I stress that. I stress that very much. You have to be interested in it in the first place to want to do it. To use an example, one thing that I noticed here was when Matt made a comment about the video games, a few parents nudged their children ever so slightly. My mother would have approved that very much, so she would have been nudging me ever so slightly. To my mother, her great thought was that I would throw away everything and go into try to develop video games. That's what she thought based on things. I had a large interest in that. But that wasn't where, as an adult, where I developed interest. I wasn't exposed to those things. I was interested in them for recreational purposes, but I wasn't necessarily interested in focusing my life on that. Instead, I ended up focusing it on education. And the last one to point out, it's if you want your daughters to be innovators, if they have an interest in around there, female role models, we know, make a big difference. In their study, when women or grew up in areas with a lot of other female inventors in the same geographic area, they were more likely to also be inventors. And the important thing is, they didn't necessarily have to know them. One thing that they might thought it was the culture of innovation was supportive for women there. So if you want your daughters to be innovators, you need to likely need to put them in a culture where women are encouraged and where the barriers for inclusion are a little less. So putting it together. And to look at Tony Stark up there. So like I said, he was an inventor. He had opportunity, lots of money. That was a good way to have opportunity, probably still is, but not the only way. He was super, super smart. But I wonder, the comic book creators who pinned him, Raj City would say, oh yeah, they did a good job. Tony Stark was exposed to weapons development. Of course he would become a weapons innovator, but I wonder if Tony Stark had been exposed to something else. If his dad, instead of designing missiles, had instead designed medical equipment, would he have been a doctor? And if his dad had done like my mom, was a principal, would he have been up here like a Duke Tib talking to you guys about innovation in education? I don't know, but we can always wonder. That's it for me.
So perhaps not surprisingly, I said this wasn't going to be like a lecture or anything, but we all talked way longer than we were supposed to. I believe we are now officially out of time, and it's supposed to be a 15-minute break. But if you'll do me a personal favor, because I was the one who talked the most, give us a couple more minutes. We'll still have a break after this before the next session, but to be able to give Victoria a chance. If she's sharing a picture of her from childhood, I feel like she's earned a little bit of, hopefully, of our time, because she has some great things to share with all of you. So we're going to go a little bit over our time, but there will still be a break. Okay, I'm looking at my boss to make sure this is the right thing to do. So I just want to turn it over to Victoria.
Hello. So as you can see, that's me up on the screen when I was your age at an award ceremony. So I have been in your shoes 8 years ago, and my parents were determined to get me the opportunities I needed to succeed. But convincing others of that wasn't a simple process. So what is the best way to advocate for your child? My parents used a combination of their own skills and the advice of others to get me to where I am today. But what exactly does the research say? So one thing to look at is the Debunking Handbook. So created by John Cook and Stefan Lewandowski, this is a series on how to debunk myths based on psychological research. So in it, they show how bringing up false beliefs can actually still reinforce them. So to avoid this and the backfire effects, they have 3 recommendations. 1, focus on core facts rather than the myth itself. So when you're bringing up myths and different ideas people have that might not be true, the myth can still retain its influence, a process called the backfire effect. See, because the myths can be seen as more familiar, so then it's more likely that they think they're true. So to avoid this, communicate your core fact first, and make sure it's loud and clear. In addition, make sure things are simple and easy to read, so people don't go back to a more simpler seeming myth. 2, if the myth is mentioned, warn people beforehand that the upcoming information is false. Like I just said, bringing up myths and ideas that aren't true can still make people feel more familiar with them. So if you are going to bring up a myth, be sure to explicitly say beforehand that it is a myth and prepare people for that. 3, include an alternate explanation that accounts for the original misinformation. So to be effective, after then you have shown the truth and then shown what the myth is, you have to then explain why the myth is wrong. Otherwise, it'll be easy enough for someone to go back to the original idea. So what does this exactly look like? You can see here, this is an example of debunking a climate myth that's shown in the debunking handbook. So if you see in the top in the headline and initial text, they mention the core facts about the climate myth, about the climate fact, and then they go into the myth after that, being sure to warn that it is a myth, and then finally they explain how that myth is misleading. So TIP actually does this same exact thing in our Just the Facts handouts. So in these handouts, we apply the principles of the debunking handbook to gifted education. And all these are found on our website under the resources tab at the location set up there. So in here, we have the student age and learning needs handout. And if you take a closer look at it, you'll notice that they say at the top, the main idea is that student age does not mean having the same learning needs. And then if you look further at the graphic, they just explain that further, showing all the typical reading levels found in a 4th grade classroom. So as you notice, not everyone is at a 4th grade reading level, and some are way above that. So this is the beginning, and then after that, in the handout, we go into what the myth is. That, of course, being the same age is the same as having the same learning needs, and then go into how exactly that myth is wrong. Now, both of these two examples here use the facts and the core data to explain away ideas in education in different fields. But is this the best way to convince others of the truth? Paul Slovic, a research psychologist at the University of Oregon, suggests no. In fact, he suggests not using data at all, but rather something else: stories. In one study they did, they provided participants and asked them to donate money after providing them with a prompt about a number of children in need. Now, as the amount of children mentioned in the prompt increased, the amount of donations decreased. This effect, commonly called compassion fade, held even when going from 1 to 2 children. Now, Slovic suggests that people relate more to personal stories, and that when you get big numbers, people just simply can't connect to them at all. So, when advocating for your child, tell your story. Their experience matters and can help change ideas in gifted education. Now, at first, these two ideas, data and stories, might seem like opposites. But if you take a look back at my talk and those of the rest of the research team, you'll notice that many of us included a lot of stories within them. So you can actually do both. And while you're sharing personal narratives, including all that information, and be sure to avoid those backfire effects. Now, what do you guys remember from these talks? Hopefully we have provided a way to jumpstart into effective advocacy. And as for how exactly data and stories work, what works when, and how that works, that's something we're working on right now. So I'm actually starting a summer project now doing exactly that, finding the most effective ways to advocate for gifted education. Hopefully I'll soon have some more tips for all of you. Thank you.
So thank you, and by right now she literally means because we went over, she's now 8 minutes late for her job because it was supposed to start about 8 minutes ago. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to turn things back over to Shauna, and she's going to tell you the new schedule that she's come up with because I talked too much.
Thank you again. Give them a round of applause, please.